I've got one. Good morning. Yes. Welcome to the Sunday morning Bible class here at Rock Hill, and we have those that are joining us online. Welcome to you as well. Our regular teacher is attending the lectureships at Harding University. We'll be in for a treat because he'll do a great job. Rather than try to step in the middle of his series, I'd like to do sort of a one-time review this morning. I want to look at some passages in the last two books of the Old Testament, Haggai and Zechariah. In order to better understand what Haggai and Zechariah are doing and to make some applications to our present day life, I'd like to give you a little historic review this morning before we begin. Both Haggai and Zechariah preached about the same time. And unlike so many of the prophets, their preaching was pretty successful. In fact, it was almost instantaneous. They got the people to do what they asked them to do, which is quite unusual for most Old Testament prophecies. Some of them preached for 50 or 60 years and apparently didn't get any converts. But nevertheless, they tried. Haggai and Zechariah preached to the first generation of the returnees from the Babylonian captivity. In other words, the folks were allowed to return from Babylon, and Zechariah and Haggai wrote to them. They hadn't been back all that long. First generation. There were a few that had been living in Palestine or Judah when the temple was destroyed some 70 years, well, actually not quite 70 years, because the Babylonian captivity actually began several years before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. And we'll give you those dates in just a few moments. In 536 BC, 536 years before the birth of Christ, Cyrus the Persian gave an edict which allowed the Jews, if they wanted to, didn't force them, but it gave them the opportunity to leave Babylon and to go back to Palestine. And they got back there, and they immediately began to clean up the mess that had been left from the temple. But what had happened in Palestine in those 70 years? Well, first of all, the Babylonians had moved some people in, and others had sort of come in on their own. And most of them certainly were not what we would call God-fearing people. They may have feared some gods, but it was the wrong God. So when the Jews came back and began to rebuild the temple, they met resistance. And unfortunately, the Jews stopped. They decided, well, maybe this isn't the right time. And so for about 16 years, the work stopped on the temple. And during that 16 years, the Jews that had returned were not very prosperous, many of them. Their crops were failing. Their enemies were surrounding them. And so, in 520 BC, 520 years before the birth of Christ, God raised up both Haggai and Zechariah to write to the Jews, to speak to them, to encourage them to do what they had gone back to do originally, and that is to rebuild the temple. Actually, the returned Jews were having a tremendous amount of economic problems, as I said. The land was not producing well. God was not blessing them, and they were scratching their head because they didn't know why. However, the response to the preachings of Zechariah and Haggai was pretty much instantaneous. And within 5 years, they rebuilt the temple, and the temple was restored. By 515 BC, the temple was back in operation in Jerusalem. But let's have a real quick review to see how we got to where we are right here with the restoration of the temple in 515 BC. The kingdom of Israel, in other words, it was the 12 tribes of Israel, wasn't it? But you remember the story that they wanted to be like everybody else. And so they started asking for a king. And finally, God told Samuel, it's not you they've rejected, it's me. Go ahead and appoint them a king. So the kingdom of Israel began about 1050 BC. It began with the appointment of Saul as the first king. And you hopefully have read through that part now if you're reading through the scriptures for this year. But you know that Saul, ultimately united all of Israel, and so the 12 tribes became the kingdom of Israel. There were 3 kings during the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom lasted about 120 years. 40 years under Saul, 40 years under David, and 40 years under Solomon. Under Solomon, the kingdom of Israel reached its greatest peak. It reached its greatest peak in terms of world influence. People from all over the world were coming and oohing and awing at the opulence of Solomon and at the wisdom of Solomon. And during Solomon's reign, God allowed Israel to acquire all of the land mass that God had promised Abraham many years before. God told Abraham, someday your children, your seed, the seed that will be like the grains of sand, in other words, there'll be so many you just couldn't count them. And they will own, and he gave the boundaries that they would own. And so under Solomon, Israel acquired all of the land that God had given to Abraham. But unfortunately, under Solomon, they acquired some other things that weren't so good. In fact, Solomon's own wives were responsible for much of the problems that were brought into Israel. You know, Solomon spent 7 years building the temple that David had brought all of the material together for him to build. But how many years did he spend on his own house? 14. 14. In other words, he spent twice as long to build his own house as he did to build the temple of God. That might tell you a little bit about Solomon's priorities. And so the kingdom of Israel had become very godly. It had become ungodly to the point that even in the temple itself, there were statues and services going on for idol gods. So, God decided to split the kingdom. God decided to take the kingdom away from Solomon's successors. And God told one of Solomon's relatives, Jeroboam, that because of the sins of Israel, I'm going to take away the kingdom. So when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam was in line for the kingship. Solomon discovered that Jeroboam was supposed to take over. Jeroboam was a relative of Solomon, and Solomon had put Jeroboam in charge of all of the forced labors in the 10 northern tribes. To show you where Solomon's priorities were, he learned that God intended to give the kingdom to Jeroboam. So what did he do? He tried to kill Jeroboam. Jeroboam got away by fleeing to Egypt. But when Solomon finally died and Rehoboam, his son, took over, they all came together, and you remember the story. The 10 tribes said, let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about who we're going to follow. Your dad was pretty rough on us. In fact, Solomon had treated the 10 tribes a lot worse than he had treated Judah. He had given Judah some exemptions from taxation and so forth that all of the 10 tribes had to bear. And they said, we'll follow you provided you'll give us some relief. Let's renegotiate this situation. And you remember the story. Rehoboam asked his older advisors, and they said, yes, it's probably a good idea. Your dad was a little rough. He was unfair to these people. It's probably time to renegotiate the deal. Then he goes to his younger advisors, and what do they tell him? Yeah, you got to be a man. You got to be tough. You got to tell him they got to respect you because they fear you. And so Rehoboam goes back and says, you think my dad was tough? My little finger is bigger than his leg, you know. Where he used whips, I'll use scorpion whips. Well, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, wasn't it? So Jeroboam said, let's go home, boys. Let's let these folks stay here by themselves and we'll go home and do our thing. And so they did, and there was a series of wars, of course, between Israel, the 10 tribes, and Judah. God did, however, leave the tribe of Judah for the sake of David, because he had promised David that one of his descendants would occupy the throne forever. By the way, does one of David's descendants occupy the throne today? Yes, he does. His name is Jesus. His name is Jesus. So he left the tribe of Judah under David's household. God told Jeroboam that the 10 northern tribes would be him. But sort of like Solomon, Jeroboam didn't trust God either. So what did Jeroboam do to try to have a firmer hold? Good morning, Zeke. What did Jeroboam do to try to have a firmer hold on his kingdom? He didn't want his Jewish subjects going back to Judah and Jerusalem, where the temple was located, because he was afraid they might get back and sort of miss their kinfolks too much. So he built 2 idols, one at Dan and the other one at, where was it? Yeah. Anyway, and he did a lot of other things. He took over the priesthood and let anybody be a priest. You didn't have to be a Levite and so forth. In other words, he invited in all kinds of ungodly religious activities. In fact, you'll find the phrase, the sin of Jeroboam, several times. I don't remember how many kings the northern kingdom had. It lasted about 200 years. I think it had 14 kings, but I didn't go back and count them. And not one of them was considered a good king. Every one of them was ungodly. And so it was only a matter of time until God took away the kingdom of Israel. The Egyptians did a part of it, and then the Assyrians came to power. And so, he built one at Dan and the other one was Bethel, yeah. In essence, this kingdom totally apostatized from the worship of God. They worshiped all kind of idols, Baal. They offered human sacrifice, and they forgot Jehovah God. It lasted, as I said, about 200 years. You remember some of the struggles, perhaps. Probably the most remembered one is Ahab and Jezebel, and God's struggle with them and the prophet Elijah had with them. But after a lot of political intrigue, the kingdom of Israel totally fell in 722 BC. And the Egyptians, the Israelites from these 10 tribes were scattered all over that part of the world. And they never, ever had a comeback, as it were, like the tribe of Israel. The tribe of Judah. The people were shipped, as I said, to many countries, and there was never a mass return. Now, the Assyrians, at the same time they destroyed the kingdom of Israel, they wanted to do the same thing for Judah. In fact, an Assyrian by the name of Sennacherib brought a large number of troops that he planned to, of course, take the whole country. He did take several cities. He even sent a group to Jerusalem and said, why don't you folks just go ahead and take the easy way out, put up the white flag, so to speak, and save yourself a lot of trouble. You think your God's going to help you? The gods of these other places didn't help them. Hezekiah was the king of Judah at the time, and Hezekiah asked the prophets, what shall we do? This man is making fun of God. He's really blaspheming. And he is told by the prophet. Isaiah the prophet tells Hezekiah, don't worry about it. Sennacherib will not build siege ramps in Jerusalem. In fact, Sennacherib won't even shoot an arrow in Jerusalem. Here's what's going to happen. He's going to hear a rumor, and he's going to have to go back to his homeland, and eventually we'll take care of him there. And that's exactly what happened. That very night, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers woke up dead. Sennacherib heard a rumor that one of his subject nations was about ready to revolt, so he went back. Now, if you read the account, it sounds like this happened like in a week's time or so. No, it really took longer. He went back to his home in Nineveh and lived there some time. Then finally, 2 of his sons killed him, and then they escaped to Egypt. So the kingdom of Judah was spared from the Assyrians. But it didn't take very long until Egypt began to get strong, and then another country that people hadn't heard of called Babylonia began to get strong. You remember the story of Hezekiah being sick? And he inquired of Isaiah the prophet, am I going to live or not? What did Isaiah tell him? Get your house in order, you're fixing to die. And Isaiah and Hezekiah turns to the wall and starts weeping and telling God, I've tried to do what you wanted me to do, and God relents. So we can change God's mind. Before he got out of the presence of the king, God told the prophet, you go back and tell him I've changed my mind. I'm going to give him 15 more years to live. And he does. And when he gets well, a leader of Babylon sends some folks to see him and congratulate him on getting well. And what does Hezekiah do? He shows off his wares, doesn't he? He shows them all of the good things he's collected in his castle. He shows them the temple and the precious things around him. And the prophet tells him, there'll come a time when those same folks from Babylon will take everything in your palace back to Babylon. And that's exactly what happens years later. The 70-year Babylonian captivity began in 606 BC. Now, actually, Babylon attacked Jerusalem 3 different times. In 606 and 597 and 536, 3 different times. There was a lot of political intrigue involved. The king of Babylon put a king on the throne, and that king decided to, pull some shady deals. And so 3 different times he attacked the city of Jerusalem, just as he predicted. But by 586 BC, the temple was destroyed. If you want to know a little bit about how it would be to live under a siege, read the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is about the siege of Jerusalem. It talks about cannibalism. It talks about starvation. It talks about, well, just the bad things that you could imagine would happen when they build siege works around a whole community and try to starve it into submission. In fact, the last siege of Babylon lasted 18 months and 27 days before they finally breached the walls, burned the walls. The king tried to flee, and then they shipped the rest of the people back to Babylon. Now, 150 years before Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persians, told the Jews that they could come back, Isaiah the prophet made a prediction. He even named Cyrus by name and said that Cyrus of the Medo-Persians would allow the Jews to go back. 150 years before it happened. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, tells us that Cyrus read his name in the Hebrew Scriptures, and that's why he decided to let the Jews go back. The siege which destroyed the temple began on January the 15th, 588 BC. As I said, it lasted 18 months and 27 days. And the temple fell, or Jerusalem fell, on July the 5th, 586 BC. The Persians, several years later, on October the 12th, 539 BC, conquered the city of Babylon. You remember the story of the handwriting on the wall? It was the king's birthday. He was celebrating it. In fact, he said, why don't you go over there and bring all those gold vessels that we brought from the temple in Jerusalem about 68 or 9 or so years ago. Bring them back over here. So they were drinking out of the gold vessels from the temple. Everybody was celebrating and feeling good, and all of a sudden this hand appeared out of nowhere and wrote on the wall, "Meeny, meeny, tinkle, usapar," something like that. The king sobered up in a hurry. He called for Daniel and said, "Daniel, I'll give you anything, up to half of my kingdom if you'll tell me what this said." And what Daniel tell him? "Keep your money, but I'll tell you anyway." And so he told the king of Babylon, "You've been weighed in the balances. You don't measure up." That very night, Babylon fell. They fell in one day, or one night actually. And then Cyrus began to, wasn't very long until Cyrus told the Jews, "You can go back." Now, there were actually 3 returns to Jerusalem. In 536, a group of them returned, and we think that this first group probably was all men. 536, a group returned under a man by the name of Zerubbabel, and they began cleaning the walls and clearing out. You can imagine what would have happened. Of course, the debris that was left from 70 years before, and then just, wind and rain and so forth. So they started cleaning it up. Then in 457 BC, a man by the name of Ezra, when Ezra sent his group back, we think there was about 40,000 Jews. Not everybody left, but because they told them, if you want to go, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But about 40,000. This included men and women and children and even some foreigners that had been taken to Babylon. They came back with Ezra's group. And then in 444 BC, Nehemiah came back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah had been appointed governor by Cyrus, who was ruling the Medo-Persians. Not Cyrus, Darius. Cyrus, the one that allowed them to come back, was quite a philosopher and an educator, but he was also a soldier. And he was killed in battle. And then Cyrus took over. Darius took over. Darius is the one that had the situation with Daniel in the lion's den. Now, I've often wondered, the advantage of the laws of the Medes and Persians. What was unusual about a law of the Medes and Persians? Once one was made, it couldn't be undone. Now, can laws in America be undone? Yeah. One of the ways that we make laws is what we call, what do they call the presidential decrees that, the next president that comes along, he can undo them. But you couldn't do that with the Medes and Persians. You remember Darius tried all night long to figure out how to save Daniel, but he couldn't. But God could. Well, this same law worked to the advantage of the Jews, because even after Cyrus was dead and Darius came on, a group back in Palestine wrote the king and said, do you know what's going on here? These guys are rebuilding the temple, and it won't be long until they'll try to overthrow you. But he went back and looked, and sure enough, a law had been made, and so Darius gave permission as well, and it was Darius that allowed Nehemiah to go back as governor. So as I said, the first group of Jews went back. They waited about 14 years or so, and then along comes Haggai and Zechariah. Now, turn, if you would, to Zechariah, the first chapter. This is God speaking through Zechariah. He said, I was very angry with your ancestors. So tell the people, this is what Yahweh of the armies of heaven says. He says, return to me, and I will return to you people. Don't be like your ancestors. In the past, the prophets proclaimed to them, and they said, This is what Yahweh of the armies of heaven says. Stop your evil ways and your evil actions. But they would not listen, or they would not pay attention, says the always present ones. Your ancestors are dead, and those prophets did not live forever. This is God speaking, I commanded my words and my laws to my servants, the prophets. And they preached to your ancestors, but they would not return to me. You know, let's go back to Haggai for a moment. Trying to find the exact verse I want here. Let's look at Haggai chapter 1, verse 9. This is God speaking to the folks here in the Jerusalem area. God says, you people look for much, yet you find little. And when you bring it home, I destroy it. Why? These people were scratching their heads. They had come back from Babylon. They had finally finished the temple, or were finishing the temple. And they couldn't understand why God was not blessing them. But notice what God says. Because you people are so busy working on your own houses while my house is still in ruins. Do you think from time to time we need to look at our priorities? You know, God knows what our priorities are. Our friends and neighbors know what our priorities are. All they've got to do is watch us a little bit. How do they know what our priorities are? That which we give our attention to, that which receives all of our efforts, pretty much defines what our priorities are, don't they? God knows what our priorities are as well. Of the 7 letters that Jesus wrote to the churches in Ephesus, which one tweaks your heart the most? Isn't it the book to the church at Laodicea? What did Jesus tell the church at Laodicea? He says, you think that you are rich. You think that you don't need anything. But in truth, you are poor, you're wretched, you're miserable, you're blind, and you're naked. Now think about a person being poor and wretched and miserable and blind and naked. You think your heart might go out to a person like that? That's what Jesus told the church in Laodicea. That's your real condition. You think you're rich. Now, he'd already told us what their problem was. What was their problem? They were lukewarm. That's what God's telling us, these folks here, through Haggai. You spend more time on your houses. You spend more time trying to gather wealth than you do trying to serve me. Jesus told the church at Laodicea something that each of us needs to individually be aware of. He said, realize from whence you have fallen. Think back where you used to be and where are you today. Something I think about, of course, hopefully I've learned a little bit more since then, but I think about the night that I was baptized into Christ. The folks that brought me home, we had gone to a gospel meeting over into a little town about, I think, 7 miles from home. And they dropped me off, and I had to walk about a quarter of a mile or so down a little dirt road to get home. But I remember thinking and feeling, wow, God has forgiven all of my sins. I remember thinking, boy, it'd be good to die tonight and go to heaven. I didn't understand God's grace as much then as I do now, but the Laodiceans had fallen a long way, just as these folks here in Jerusalem had fallen a long way. They were more concerned with their personal assets than they were what belonged to God. Jesus told the church in Laodicea, remember from where you have fallen. You've left your first love. God knows our priorities, just as our neighbors know our priorities. You spend more time on your own personal houses than you do on my house. Now, we don't need to hammer and a nail and try to build a temple anywhere, but the principle is the same, isn't it? There is work to be done. There are activities that we need to be engaged in and involved in, and that tells God and that tells us. I think of the situation where Jesus is at the temple and he's sort of watching the folks come by and drop money into the collection plate, and literally some or they would drop things in, they would hold it up and look around, and somebody would blow a whistle or ring a bell, everybody look here, and they would drop their stuff in the pot, kerchunk. And the little lady walks up and drops 2 little coins, clink. And what did Jesus say? You see that lady? She has given more than all of these put together. God knows our priorities. May God help us to check our priorities on a regular basis. Let's turn to Haggai, the 2nd chapter, and read verses 10 to 14. Pardon me?
They were doing that as an out-show.
Yeah.
They weren't doing it for the purpose of God.
You know, we can do the right thing for the wrong reason. And we can do the wrong thing for the right reason. And both of them are wrong. Haggai told these folks, Look at yourself. You're building fine houses, and God's house is still in ruins. You're doing all of these things to collect money. They were even enslaving their own brothers, as we would say, brothers in Christ. About that time, but go back and read Haggai. It's just 2 chapters. I don't know if it's the shortest book in the Old Testament or not. I think it is. But let's look at our priorities. May God help us to want to be pleasing to Him. You remember what Samuel the prophet told Saul when Saul had disobeyed God? He said, to obey is better than sacrifice. To hearken, in other words, to listen to what God wants and to do it, is to better than the fat of rams. God bless you.